Homeless man offers Ronaldo food. What Ronaldo does next brings him to tears. The streets of Lisbon buzzed with life. Neon lights flickered above cafes, casting a soft glow on the sidewalks where waiters rushed between tables. The air smelled of roasted chestnuts, fresh bread, and the distant aroma of grilled fish from the late-night eateries lining the narrow streets. But amidst the warmth and movement, beneath the golden light of street lamps, a man sat alone. His name was Lucas. His coat was worn, fraying at the seams, but it was the only barrier between him and the cold stone bench he had come to know as home. His beard had grown wild over time, and his fingers, rough and calloused, trembled slightly as he unwrapped a small sandwich, his only meal for the night. It wasn't much. Just a piece of bread and a slice of ham he had been given by a kind-hearted cafe owner. But it was enough. Or at least it had to be. Lucas adjusted his position, his body aching from nights of sleeping in the open. As he lifted the sandwich to his lips, his gaze wandered across the street, drawn to a man sitting alone at a distant table outside a restaurant. The man looked familiar. His face was partly hidden under a hood, his posture slightly hunched, but there was something in the way he carried himself, the way he tapped his fingers against the table, lost in thought, that made Lucas pause. And then recognition hit. Cristiano Ronaldo. Lucas had seen his face 1,000 times before. On billboards, on televisions and store windows, in the newspapers he sometimes used as blankets on colder nights. But here he was, in the flesh, sitting alone, seemingly unnoticed by the world that usually couldn't get enough of him. Lucas frowned. Something wasn't right. This was Cristiano Ronaldo. The legend. The man who had everything. Why was he sitting here, alone, staring at nothing? Lucas hesitated for a long moment before looking down at his sandwich. It was ridiculous. What was he even thinking? He barely had enough food for himself, and yet the idea had already taken root in his mind. Maybe the man needed it more than he did. Maybe he needed something, someone, to remind him that the world wasn't just about money and trophies. Before he could stop himself, Lucas stood. He crossed the street, the weight of exhaustion and uncertainty heavy on his shoulders. As he approached, Ronaldo didn't look up. His focus remained on the table, his fingers tracing invisible patterns on the smooth surface. Lucas cleared his throat. "Sir," he said, his voice rough from disuse. Ronaldo's head lifted slightly, his eyes focusing on the man in front of him. Lucas hesitated, his grip tightening around the sandwich. I don't mean to disturb you, but you look like you could use something to eat." For a long moment, Ronaldo just stared. Then, slowly, his gaze dropped to the sandwich in Lucas's outstretched hand. The silence stretched. Lucas felt his chest tighten. Had he made a mistake? He knew what people thought of men like him: dirty, pitiful, invisible. He had spent years being ignored, his presence blending into the background like an unwanted smudge in the perfect picture of other people's lives. He prepared for rejection, for disgust, for Ronaldo to wave him off like so many others had before. But instead, Ronaldo's expression softened. His brow furrowed, not in annoyance but in something closer to disbelief. "You're giving me your food?" Ronaldo's voice was quieter than Lucas expected. Almost tired. Lucas swallowed. "It's not much, but..." He shrugged, glancing down at the sandwich. "It's all I've got." Another silence. Then something remarkable happened. Ronaldo smiled. Not the smile from magazine covers or press conferences. Not the polished, practiced grin he gave reporters after a game-winning goal. This was something different. Something real. He reached out, slowly, carefully, and took the sandwich from Lucas's hands. "Thank you," Ronaldo said, his voice sincere. Lucas nodded quickly, stepping back as if expecting the moment to end there. But Ronaldo didn't let it. "Sit with me," he said. Lucas froze. He wasn't sure if he had heard correctly. "What?" "Sit," Ronaldo repeated, gesturing to the chair across from him. Lucas hesitated. No one had invited him to sit in years. Not at a table. Not in a place like this. And certainly not someone like Cristiano Ronaldo. His instincts told him to refuse. To leave before the moment could be taken away. But something in Ronaldo's gaze held him there. Tentatively, Lucas lowered himself onto the chair. A waiter approached almost immediately, but before he could shoo Lucas away, Ronaldo spoke. "Can you bring us 2 coffees?" he asked, his tone casual, as if it were the most normal request in the world. The waiter blinked but nodded quickly, disappearing inside. Lucas shifted uncomfortably, his fingers gripping the edge of the table. He wasn't used to this. He wasn't used to being seen. Ronaldo studied him for a moment before leaning back in his chair. "What's your name?" Lucas hesitated. Lucas? Lucas, Ronaldo repeated, nodding as if committing it to memory. The silence stretched again, but this time it wasn't awkward. It was understanding. Then Ronaldo exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. You know, he said slowly, this is the first time in years someone has given me something without expecting anything in return. Lucas frowned. That can't be true. Ronaldo gave him a small, knowing smile. It is? Lucas wasn't sure how to respond to that. I'm not who people think I am, Ronaldo continued. Or maybe I am, and that's the problem. Lucas tilted his head. And who do people think you are? Ronaldo chuckled, shaking his head. Someone who has everything. Lucas thought about that. Then quietly he said, but you don't. Ronaldo's smile faded slightly. The waiter returned, setting down 2 steaming cups of coffee before disappearing again. Lucas hesitated before wrapping his hands around the warm ceramic mug, letting the heat seep into his fingers. You gave me your food, Ronaldo said after a moment, studying him. Why? Lucas exhaled. Because you looked like you needed it? Ronaldo nodded slowly, as if those words meant more to him than he could explain. Lucas took a sip of his coffee, letting the warmth spread through his chest. He had expected this night to be like any other. Cold, hungry, invisible. And yet here he was, sitting with Cristiano Ronaldo. Talking. Being heard. For the first time in years, Lucas felt something stir in his chest. Oh. The coffee between them cooled slowly, steam rising in soft curls that faded into the night air. Lucas sat stiffly, his fingers wrapped around the ceramic cup, though he had barely taken a sip. The weight of the moment pressed against his ribs, making it hard to breathe. Ronaldo, however, seemed in no rush. He sat with a quiet ease, fingers tapping lightly against the side of his cup. It was strange. Lucas had seen this man before many times from a distance. On posters, in televisions playing through shop windows, in the faces of young boys who kicked ragged footballs through the streets, whispering his name like a prayer. But here, sitting across from him, he wasn't Ronaldo the legend. He was just a man. A man who looked tired. Lucas studied him carefully, unsure of what to say. He was used to silence. Used to being ignored, used to fading into the background, his presence something people passed by without thought. But Ronaldo had invited him to sit. Had asked for his name. And Lucas wasn't sure how to exist in a world where someone like Cristiano Ronaldo saw him. You don't talk much, Ronaldo said suddenly, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. Lucas shifted, clearing his throat. Not much to say. Ronaldo studied him for a long moment, as if searching for something beneath the layers of exhaustion, beneath the fraying coat, beneath the roughness of his hands. Then quietly he asked, how long have you been living on the streets? Lucas inhaled sharply. He had been asked many things in his life. How did you get here? What went wrong? Where's your family? The questions always came with pity, with judgment, with the unspoken belief that he had somehow chosen this life. But Ronaldo's voice held none of that. Just curiosity. And something else. Something close to understanding. Lucas exhaled, staring down at his coffee. Too long. Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was heavy. It was real. Ronaldo took a sip of his coffee, his gaze never leaving Lucas. Do you remember the first night? He asked. The first night you had nowhere to go? Lucas's fingers tightened around his cup. The memory came fast, hitting him like a punch to the ribs. He had been standing outside a closed bakery, staring at the reflection of himself in the glass. His hands had been shaking, his stomach tight with hunger. The city had felt too big, too cold, too unforgiving. And he had been so alone. Yes, Lucas whispered. I remember. Ronaldo nodded slowly. I do too. Lucas blinked, confused. You? Ronaldo let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. I wasn't homeless. Not like you. But I had nights where I felt like I was. His fingers traced the rim of his cup. When I was younger, before football gave me everything, I had nothing. My family struggled. There were nights we didn't eat. Nights my mother cried herself to sleep, thinking we didn't notice. Lucas watched him closely. I had a dream, Ronaldo continued, his voice quiet. But dreams don't put food on the table. They don't keep the cold out. And there were moments, real moments, when I thought maybe I should stop. Maybe I should do something practical. Get a normal job. Take care of my family in a way that felt safe. Lucas tilted his head. But you didn't? Ronaldo exhaled, a small smile ghosting over his lips. No. Someone believed in me before I believed in myself. And that changed everything. Lucas felt something sharp lodge itself in his chest. Because no one had ever done that for him. Ronaldo leaned forward slightly, his eyes locked onto Lucas's. You offering me food tonight? That wasn't just kindness. That was who you are. Lucas swallowed hard, his throat suddenly tight. You don't have much, Ronaldo continued. But you still gave. You still looked at me and saw a person. Not a football player. Not a celebrity. Just a man sitting alone who looked like he needed something. Lucas had spent so long being invisible that he had forgotten what it was like to be acknowledged. To be seen not as a problem to be solved, but as a human being who still mattered. His chest ached. Because for the first time in years he did. Ronaldo sat back, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. I have an idea, he said suddenly. Lucas frowned. An idea? Ronaldo's lips quirked upward. Come with me. Lucas tensed. His first instinct was to say no. People like him didn't go anywhere with people like Ronaldo. They stayed in the background. They didn't follow men who lived in mansions, who played on the world's biggest stages. But then Ronaldo stood. And he was waiting. Lucas stared up at him, his heart pounding. And then, with the weight of 1,000 nights spent alone pressing against his ribs, he slowly rose to his feet. And followed. The car was sleek, the kind of thing Lucas had only ever seen in passing, through glass windows or on television screens that flickered in shop fronts. The kind of car he had never touched, never even stood near for too long in fear of being chased away. And now he was sitting in one. Ronaldo drove in silence for a while, the streets of Lisbon flashing past them in a blur of neon and shadow. Lucas stared out the window, feeling strangely weightless. For years, he had been tethered to the same corners of this city. He had memorized the cold stone of his usual sleeping spot, the alleys where he knew he could find a little warmth. Now, for the first time in as long as he could remember, he was moving. After a while, Lucas finally asked, Where are we going? Ronaldo glanced at him, his smirk returning. You'll see. Lucas exhaled, shaking his head. You're enjoying this, aren't you? Ronaldo laughed. A little. Lucas huffed but said nothing else. A few minutes later, the car pulled up in front of a building that made Lucas's stomach flip. It was a hotel. But not just any hotel. One of the nicest in Lisbon. The kind of place that had guards at the entrance, where the lobby smelled like expensive cologne and fresh flowers, where men in suits walked with purpose, carrying their lives in leather briefcases. Lucas stiffened. I can't go in there. Ronaldo gave him a sideways glance. Why not? Lucas gestured to himself. His coat was frayed at the edges, his shoes barely held together. Look at me. Ronaldo did. And then he simply said, So? Lucas blinked. Before he could argue, Ronaldo stepped out of the car, walking toward the entrance like he owned the place. And maybe he did. Lucas hesitated, his entire body screaming at him to stay put. But Ronaldo looked over his shoulder. And he was waiting. Lucas forced his feet to move. And then, for the second time that night, he followed. The hotel lobby was everything Lucas expected it to be: marble floors, crystal chandeliers, the quiet hum of wealth filling every corner. He felt eyes on him almost instantly. The receptionist stiffened. A few guests gave him quick, dismissive glances before looking away. But Ronaldo didn't hesitate. He walked straight to the front desk. A room, he said simply. The receptionist blinked. For you, sir? Ronaldo shook his head, stepping aside so Lucas was fully visible. For him? Silence. Lucas's stomach tightened. He didn't belong here. But Ronaldo didn't care. And after a moment of stunned hesitation, neither did the receptionist. Minutes later, a keycard was placed in Lucas's trembling hands. His throat burned. His chest ached. And for the first time in years, he felt something he had forgotten existed. Hope. Lucas stood frozen, gripping the keycard like it might disappear if he let go. His fingers trembled slightly, his breath shallow. He had spent years convincing himself that people like him didn't get chances like this. And yet, here he was, standing in one of the finest hotels in Lisbon, holding proof that, for tonight at least, he had a place to stay that wasn't a cold park bench or a cramped shelter. He turned to Ronaldo, trying to understand. Why are you doing this? Ronaldo's expression remained unreadable. Because I can. Lucas swallowed hard. He wanted to argue, to say that wasn't an answer, but the weight of exhaustion pressed down on him. He hadn't slept in a real bed in longer than he could remember. He needed to be practical, needed to take what was being offered before it was taken away. Still, his pride gnawed at him. I don't have any money. Ronaldo gave a small shrug. I didn't ask for any. Lucas shifted uncomfortably. I can't pay you back. Ronaldo's lips quirked slightly, the ghost of a smile. Not everything has to be repaid, Lucas. That name, spoken so casually, sent a strange shiver through him. He had spent so long being invisible that hearing someone, especially someone like Ronaldo, say his name felt almost surreal. Lucas exhaled shakily and nodded, shoving the keycard into his pocket before he could second-guess himself. "All right." Ronaldo nodded toward the elevators. "Go get some rest." Lucas hesitated. "What about you?" "I have business to attend to." Lucas glanced at the gleaming marble floors, at the finely dressed guests weaving through the lobby. He didn't belong here. And yet, Ronaldo had handed him a place in this world, at least for tonight. He had no right to question why. So, without another word, he turned and walked toward the elevators. His hands shook as he pressed the button. The moment the doors opened, he stepped inside, expecting someone to stop him. No one did. He rode up in silence, the soft chime announcing each floor. When he finally reached the right one, he stepped out onto the plush carpet, his feet sinking into it like clouds. It had been so long since he had felt something this soft beneath his feet. Finding the room number, he slid the keycard into the lock, half expecting it to deny him. But the light blinked green and the door clicked open. He stepped inside, his breath catching in his throat. The room was enormous, not just by his standards, by anyone's. A king-sized bed sat in the center, draped in pristine white sheets. A flat-screen television hung on the wall opposite it. There was a seating area, a massive window overlooking the glittering city lights, and when he turned his head, an ensuite bathroom with a walk-in shower that looked like something out of a luxury magazine. Lucas closed the door behind him and leaned against it, exhaling shakily. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. Maybe he had fallen asleep in the park again, and this was all some cruel, beautiful dream. But the warmth of the room, the clean scent of fresh linen and subtle cologne, the soft hum of the air conditioning, it was all too real. For a long moment he just stood there trying to process it. Then, his legs finally gave out, and he sank onto the edge of the bed, gripping the comforter like a lifeline. It had been so long since he had sat on something this soft. The weight of exhaustion pressed heavily on him, but he was afraid to lie down, afraid that if he closed his eyes, it would all disappear. He forced himself to stand again, moving toward the bathroom. The sight of himself in the mirror made him flinch. The grime on his face, the hollow look in his eyes, the clothes that hung loosely from his thin frame, it was all a painful reminder of the life he had been living. Without thinking, he turned on the water, letting the steam rise. The heat spread through the air, and for a moment he just stood there, inhaling deeply. Then, slowly, cautiously, he peeled off his worn-out clothes and stepped under the stream. The hot water hit his skin and his entire body shuddered. It felt like a baptism. Like he was washing away more than just dirt. He let the water run over him, let it soothe the aches in his muscles, let it cleanse the shame that had clung to him for years. By the time he finally stepped out, his skin was raw, but he felt lighter. He wrapped himself in one of the thick plush towels and walked back into the room. His old clothes lay in a pathetic pile on the floor. He couldn't bring himself to put them back on. That was when he noticed something on the chair near the bed. A neatly folded set of clothes. He blinked. Had they been there before? He was sure they hadn't. And yet there they were, clean new, his size. Ronaldo. Lucas hesitated, then walked over and picked up the fabric. The material was soft, expensive. He dressed quickly, the clothes fitting him perfectly. It was strange, wearing something that wasn't threadbare, something that didn't smell like the streets. He sat back down on the bed, staring at his reflection in the window. A different man looked back at him. For the first time in years, he didn't look homeless. He didn't look invisible. He looked like someone with a chance. His throat tightened, and he exhaled shakily, pressing his hands together to stop them from trembling. The exhaustion was becoming unbearable now. The pull of sleep was stronger than his fear of losing this moment. So, finally, hesitantly, he lay back on the bed. The mattress cradled him, softer than anything he had ever known. And for the first time in years, Lucas allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, tomorrow would be different. A knock at the door startled him just as his eyelids began to droop. His heart pounded as he hesitated before standing up, padding over to the door with cautious steps. He opened it slightly, peeking through the crack. A bellhop stood there, holding a tray. "Mr. Lucas?" he asked politely. Lucas blinked in surprise. Yes? Compliments of Mr. Ronaldo. He insisted you have something warm to eat." The sight of the silver tray made Lucas's stomach twist with hunger. The aroma of freshly baked bread, roasted meat, and something sweet filled the hallway. His throat tightened as he stepped back, nodding slowly. The bellhop entered, setting the tray down on the small table by the window. "Enjoy, sir." Let us know if you need anything." Lucas barely heard him leave. He sat down, staring at the feast before him. Ronaldo had thought of everything. And Lucas wasn't sure if he should feel grateful or terrified by what that meant. But for now, for this one night, he chose to be grateful. He picked up the fork, hands still trembling, and took his first bite of real food in what felt like a lifetime. As he chewed, the flavors overwhelmed him, rich and comforting in a way he had nearly forgotten. The warmth of the meal spread through him, anchoring him to this new reality. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something more than just one night of comfort.